Hello and welcome to Politics for the People. I'm your host, Michael. Thanks for joining us. However you are, if it's on YouTube, your favorite podcast platform, either way, please make sure that you are subscribed. If you're on YouTube, hit the like button, and please do click the bell to be notified of when we post new episodes. And please also, if you haven't already, do follow us on social media, on Instagram at Politics for the People Podcast, and on Twitter at PoliticsPeoplePod. That's Politics PPLPOD. And please do check out our Patreon page. If you haven't, head on over there. Even if you don't plan on becoming a patron, of course, we hope that you do. There's plenty of other great supplemental materials to the podcast that are available free to the public. Of course, if you do become a patron and subscribe, you will get exclusive content as well as a say in what goes into the making of the episode, so check it out. On today's episode, we're going to take a look at the two parties that we have, the modern-day Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and where they came from, how these two parties developed, because they're not the ones that we've always had, and they've even changed significantly since they were first created. So let's go back to the inception of the country. We've won the Revolutionary War, we're past the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. The original founding fathers, for the most part, were actually generally against any sort of a party system. They didn't like the idea of people adhering to a party platform. They were more interested in politicians who had their own opinions, but also represented the wills and beliefs of their constituents. That was more the goal. But of course, we know that's not how it worked out. What eventually ended up happening fairly quickly was Washington divided into two camps. One camp became known as the Federalists, and they were, for the most part, represented by George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, people like that. The other camp became known as the Democratic Republicans. They went through a couple of different names, Jeffersonian Republicans, but really became known as the Democratic Republicans, represented mainly by Thomas Jefferson, as I alluded to with the name, and James Madison. And these two parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, were most at odds about how centralized the government should be and what the banking system of the government should be. Of course, Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, worked very hard to establish a national bank of the United States. And one of the cruxes of the Democratic Republicans' argument was that that should not exist. And of course, the Federalists held power at first because George Washington was a Federalist. And then John Adams served a 4-year term after Washington, who was also a Federalist. After Adams, Thomas Jefferson was elected, and that was the first time that a political party other than the Federalists were in power. And then moving on from Thomas Jefferson, we saw the early part of the 19th century relatively dominated by Democratic Republicans, and the Federalist Party kind of faded after the election of 1824, which was notable because the Democratic Republican Party didn't just put up one main candidate for president. The party had become so large and so powerful, which also means it was so representative of so many people, that there were different ideas in the party. What ended up happening was a contested election where John Quincy Adams was named president, even though Andrew Jackson had won more of the popular vote. In response to this, the party, which had become so large and it was trying to encompass so many ideas, fractured. And we ended up with the birth of the Democratic Party that we have today, which was led at the time by Andrew Jackson, and really took a firm stance against the Bank of the United States, that centralized bank that we mentioned earlier, and took a hard line supporting states' rights, minimal government regulation, really pushing for a decentralized government. And the other part of the party that split off became known as the Whig Party, WHIG. And they really took up the mantle of directly opposing Andrew Jackson and the Democrats by supporting the National Bank with an eye more towards a centralized, focused federal government. Then again, as the Democratic Party continued to gain power, gain a broader base, represent more ideas, ran into the same problem as they had when they were the Democratic-Republican Party of diametrically opposed ideas within the party's base. This time, though, it was centered around the idea of slavery. Southern Democrats believed that slavery should be expanded west into the new territories and states that were being developed, and the Northern Democrats wanted it to be decided by states and localities. They weren't abolitionists, but I think there's an argument to be made that they saw the changing tides, how sentiments were changing, opinions were changing, and they were worried about losing too many people from the party or not bringing more people into the party. So they wanted the individual states and localities to be able to determine whether or not slavery would be legal there. This infighting within the Democratic Party got to such a point where it allowed a new party to form, the Republican Party, and a president to be elected from that party in Abraham Lincoln in the election of 1860. This new Republican Party was formed by a coalition of Whigs, Democrats that had become disillusioned with their party, and some other politicians from parties that had sprouted up over the years. They realized for it to be possible to abolish slavery, they had to come together, break from their own parties, and form a new party. And at the heart of that Republican Party was the idea of abolishing slavery. Now, of course, as we know, these tensions very quickly led to 7 southern states seceding from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America, and the Civil War. Of course, the Union won, the Confederacy was dissolved, but those tensions still remained. Southern states were primarily Democratic, had conservative, anti-big business beliefs. Their lifestyle was very agrarian-based, so the industrialization that was quickly coming was very threatening to that way of life. And the base constituency for that Southern Democratic Party really was white people who were frustrated and angered by Republican policies and Reconstruction and all that they felt had been taken away from them. Meanwhile, the northern states remained predominantly Republican. They fought for civil and voting rights for African Americans, for newly freed slaves. And it's this group that really benefited from the expanded power of the federal government that had come during the Civil War. And as that Republican base had become so comfortable, the party became more oriented towards economic growth, industry, big business, and it became seen very much as the party of the wealthy and the elite. Eventually, they started really championing progressive ideas, improve the life of the working class. They were more socially progressive. They pushed for economic and labor reforms, even though they did also encourage Protestant values such as prohibition. The most notable Republican at this time probably was Theodore Roosevelt, who of course served as president and in some ways set the stage for even more progressive ideas to come in the future. This Republican success that we mentioned earlier continued through the 1920s until, of course, the Great Depression, when many Americans blamed the Republicans, who had been in power for so long, for the financial crisis going on in the country, which led to the election of a Democrat in Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But Roosevelt wasn't the typical Southern Democrat with such conservative values. FDR introduced his New Deal, which was made up of progressive government-funded programs. It established and secured Social Security, improved infrastructure around the country to help get people back to work, and instituted a federal minimum wage. Since these policies were not traditionally considered democratic ideas, a lot of more conservative people in the party felt that it no longer represented them. So they left and became Republicans. And this is where you start to see that shift in the Democratic Party more towards the political agenda as we know it today. After FDR passed away, President Harry Truman continued pushing his progressive policies, including and notably a very pro-civil rights agenda and the desegregation of the military. And this is where we see a lot of support from African Americans and former slaves who, of course, had been Republicans. Why wouldn't they be Republicans? Abraham Lincoln had been a Republican. Republicans had fought for their rights. But now the tides were changing. Democrats seem to be taking up that mantle, so this is where we have the beginnings of that demographic switch. In this time period, in the mid-1900s, we really saw a period of Democratic dominance. From 1932 to 1980, Republicans only won 4 presidential elections, and they only had a congressional majority for 4 years. It's also during this time that we see many Southern Democrats, who became known as Dixiecrats, move to the GOP, the Republicans, in opposition to the ideas of big government, expanded labor unions, civil rights, more conservative social issues, especially from what's become known as the religious right on the issue of abortion, and the continuing push of African Americans who had been Republicans to the Democratic Party. And leading up to the 1980 election is really when we see the modern party platforms develop. The Democratic platform remained based on more of the FDR, Truman-style policies, and then the conservative movement really became the basis of the Republican platform. Think about the ideas that President Reagan ran on. Socially very conservative, cutting taxes, claiming to be preserving family values, and a drastic increase in military funding. Since President Reagan's election, the parties have continued to swap power. With how partisan and divided our politics and our country have gotten, it's hard to imagine either party holding power for a stretch of time like the Democrats did in the mid-1900s. But what has been in the news a lot lately, and what does seem like it may be happening, could possibly be another time of fracturing of a party. With the debate going on in the Republican Party right now between more Trumpian-style politics and traditional conservative policies, and on the Democratic side, between the more moderate wing of the party and the more progressive wing of the party, it remains to be seen how much longer we'll have the two parties of the Republicans and the Democrats. Now let's take a moment to talk about how this impacts our everyday lives. Why does it matter what the main political parties are? Why does it matter what they're called? Why are we addressing this? Of course, it doesn't matter what they're called. What matters more is not just what the policies are. Of course, that matters. But more importantly, how many of them are there? When you look at our two-party system, there are certain things that it works very well for, but one of the largest arguments for abandoning the two-party system for multiple parties, more than two, is an idea that's usually touted as very quote-unquote American. The idea of competition, bringing out the best. Of course, with a two-party system, you'll have the two main opinions on an argument, and who's ever in the majority wins. But if you have more than just two political parties, there's actually more room and potential for a debate to get to some sort of a consensus to move forward on an issue. And of course, this can happen in a two-party system. Just look at our history. We've had a two-party system, even though it was inadvertent, and look at how much we've been able to accomplish. But when we're in a time like we're in right now, where Congress has, in many ways, ceased to function. It's the legislative branch. They haven't been able to legislate in a very long time. It can be an enticing or, at very least, intriguing conversation to have of what if there were more than just two parties? And of course, we do have more than two parties. If you take the time and look in your area, I'm sure there are other active political parties. They just don't have the power and the authority and, of course, the money that the two main parties do, the Republicans and the Democrats. So, of course, we're not telling you to change your party affiliation, but this would be a good opportunity for you to take a moment and Google other political parties. See who else is out there, what they're saying, and whether or not you agree with some of those ideas. It may be that you find a candidate for an office that you agree with more than one from the party to which you're registered. And that's fine. Maybe you'll consider voting for them. Maybe you won't. That's up to you. But we encourage you to be as informed as possible. Thanks for joining us on this episode. If you're listening on your podcast platform of choice, please do make sure that you're subscribed. If you're on YouTube, make sure you're subscribed. Click the bell icon to be notified of when we post new episodes, and please do like this video. And also don't forget to follow us on social media, on Instagram at Politics for the People Podcast, on Twitter at Politics People Pod, that's Politics PPLPOD, and do check out our Patreon page. As I said earlier, there's a ton of great content there, even if you're not going to become a patron, but of course, we hope that you will support the show. And of course, thank you to our patrons. It means so much that you support the show and what we do. We'll be back next week with another episode. Take care.